In early 537 AD, from the towering ramparts of the Mausoleum of Hadrian in Rome, the heavy deafening crack of classical marble shattering against stone echoed over the Tiber River. Desperate imperial soldiers, out of arrows and standard ammunition, were physically tearing down the priceless, centuries-old statues of gods and emperors, breaking them into heavy fragments to hurl down upon the ranks of the Ostrogothic army below. This grim act of cultural destruction was not vandalism, but the absolute, brutal math of survival. Supreme Commander Belisarius had been tasked with holding the sprawling 12-mile perimeter of the Eternal City with a garrison of merely 5,000 regular troops, while an encroaching enemy force of nearly 100,000 men battered against the ancient gates. Welcome back to World Chronicles. Today, we break down the Siege of Rome, a brutal masterclass in defensive warfare, psychological endurance, and the exact moment the ancient world was broken to save the city. To hold a fortress of this magnitude against a force 20 times his size, Belisarius could not rely on open field combat or sheer brute strength. He had to weaponize the ancient infrastructure of the capital itself, converting imperial tombs into heavily fortified citadels and manipulating the urban geography to constantly outmaneuver a numerically superior enemy. This siege was not merely a clash of iron, it was a desperate race against starvation, disease, and the structural limits of human discipline. If the imperial army failed, the grand strategic vision of a restored empire would die in the rubble of Italy. But holding the line meant surviving a year of relentless, grinding attrition, navigating the paranoia of sealed sewers and severed aqueducts, and enduring the crushing psychological weight of fighting for a civilization that was being forced to dismantle its own heritage just to see another dawn. The directive to reclaim the lost territories of the Western Roman Empire originated over 1,000 miles away in the court at Constantinople. Emperor Justinian was driven by a singular, consuming geopolitical strategy known as the Renovatio Imperii, the restoration of the empire to its former borders. Holding the wealthy eastern provinces was no longer sufficient for his political legitimacy. To truly rule as a Roman emperor, Justinian needed to control the ancient capital itself. The mandate fell to his most capable field commander, Belisarius. Armed with the emperor's orders and a highly specialized expeditionary force, Belisarius executed a series of rapid, highly successful campaigns. He systematically dismantled the Vandal kingdom in North Africa and aggressively pushed up the Italian peninsula, relying on speed, strict discipline, and elite heavy cavalry to outmaneuver localized resistance. By late 536 AD, this momentum carried the imperial army directly to the gates of Rome. The political pressure on the Ostrogothic garrison stationed inside the capital was immense. Recognizing that they lacked the civilian support and the immediate tactical strength to hold the sprawling urban center, the Ostrogoths evacuated the capital just as Belisarius approached. Pope Silverius, acting on behalf of the Roman Senate and the civilian population, formally invited the supreme commander into the city. The imperial army marched through the Asinarian Gate unopposed, reclaiming the Eternal City for the imperial government for the first time in 6 decades. The symbolic victory for Justinian was absolute, broadcasting a powerful message of imperial resurgence across the Mediterranean world. However, capturing classical Rome and holding it were two completely different logistical realities. The city was a vast, porous monument to past glory, entirely dependent on complex external supply lines for its grain and water. Belisarius immediately recognized the tactical nightmare he had inherited. His expeditionary force of 5,000 men was engineered for rapid maneuver warfare, not for statically garrisoning a metropolis surrounded by an expansive defensive circuit. Furthermore, the Ostrogothic king, Vitiges, had not been defeated. He had made a cold, calculated strategic withdrawal. Vitiges willingly surrendered the political capital to consolidate his military strength in the highly defensible, marsh-surrounded northern capital of Ravenna. There, safely removed from imperial interference, the king issued a general call to arms, mobilizing every available Germanic warrior across northern Italy to form a unified, massive counteroffensive. The imperial army had taken the Eternal City without spilling a drop of blood. But they were about to discover that Vitiges had not surrendered Italy. He had merely stepped back to prepare an overwhelming counterstrike. Vitiges marched south with a terrifying host of an estimated 100,000 men. This was not a border skirmish or a localized raid. It was a massive national levy designed to crush imperial resistance through absolute kinetic weight. The Ostrogothic army was anchored by its fierce heavy cavalry, warriors bred for close quarters shock combat with lance and broadsword, completely disdaining the use of the bow. Against this encroaching juggernaut, Supreme Commander Belisarius fielded a mere 5,000 regular troops. The backbone of his defense was his personal bucellari, elite heavy cavalry archers who possessed the rare devastating ability to loose arrows at full gallop before crashing into the enemy line with lances. Yet, the greatest threat to these highly trained veterans was not merely the enemy infantry, but the unforgiving geometry of the battlefield itself. The capital was protected by the Aurelian walls, a towering, unbroken line of red brick and defensive turrets stretching for 12 miles. The mathematical reality of holding this sprawling perimeter was a tactical nightmare. If Belisarius distributed his 5,000 troops evenly along the 12-mile wall, the defenses would be stretched fatally thin, leaving barely a few hundred men to guard each mile. A concentrated Ostrogothic assault against any single gate would instantly shatter such a static line. Recognizing that rigid defense meant certain annihilation, the Supreme Commander implemented a doctrine of extreme structural discipline and interior mobility. He stripped the walls of unnecessary personnel, stationing only small, deeply entrenched holding forces at the most vulnerable gates and vital choke points. The bulk of his elite bucellari and veteran infantry was then repurposed into a rapid reaction reserve force, held centrally within the city. This strategy relied entirely on the interior lines of communication provided by the ancient capital. By utilizing the wide, paved Roman streets to rapidly shift troops along the inner perimeter, Belisarius could artificially inflate his numbers, concentrating his mobile cavalry exactly where the Ostrogothic army massed their attacks. The success of this active defense required flawless coordination and unbreakable nerve. Every officer holding a gate had strict orders: weather the initial impact of the siege engines and hold the barricades just long enough for the mobile reserves to arrive. The sharp, rapid clatter of armored hooves striking the ancient flagstones became the defining rhythm of the imperial defense as cavalry units sprinted continuously from one threatened sector to another to plug the gaps. This highly calibrated system stood in stark contrast to the Ostrogothic approach. Vitiges relied on the sheer, overwhelming mass of tens of thousands of warriors pushing against the gates simultaneously, attempting to exhaust the defenders and stretch the imperial reserves until they simply snapped. Belisarius had to manage not just the precise physical placement of his regular troops, but the crushing psychological pressure of commanding men who stared down an enemy host that literally blackened the fields beyond the gates. Belisarius had engineered a brilliant defensive doctrine on paper, but a fortress of that magnitude possessed one fatal geographical vulnerability that no amount of cavalry could protect. In March 537 AD, the vanguard of Vitiges' massive host finally closed the distance, systematically surrounding Rome with 7 sprawling, heavily fortified camps. But the Ostrogothic king did not immediately order his warriors to throw themselves against the imposing brickwork of the Aurelian walls. Instead, he targeted the city's highly exposed logistical arteries. Classical Rome was entirely dependent on a vast external network of elevated aqueducts that funneled millions of gallons of fresh water from the surrounding countryside into the metropolis every single day. Vitiges ordered his engineers to systematically breach these ancient marvels, severing the massive stone channels and instantly cutting off the capital's lifeblood. The tactical effect was immediate and crippling. The great public baths, enduring symbols of Roman civilization, were drained and permanently abandoned. However, acute thirst was only a secondary threat. The true immediate danger was rapid starvation. The plunging waters of the Aqua Traiana had historically powered the massive industrial-scale grain mills situated on the slopes of the Janiculum Hill. These mills ground the flour necessary to sustain both the trapped civilian population and the imperial garrison. When the aqueducts were breached, the heavy grinding stones ground to a halt, plunging the industrial heart of the city into a sudden, chilling silence. Without functioning mills, the carefully rationed raw grain stockpiles were rendered practically useless, and the besieged capital faced the prospect of internal collapse before a single Ostrogothic siege ladder was even constructed. Facing an infrastructure failure that threatened to break the morale of his 5,000 regular troops, Supreme Commander Belisarius responded with cold, pragmatic ingenuity. Recognizing that the Ostrogoths could not easily dam or divert the rushing current of the Tiber River without fatally dividing their own forces, Belisarius completely bypassed the ruined aqueducts. He ordered his engineers to string heavy ropes across the deep river channel near the city's bridges, securely mooring pairs of small riverboats directly in the swiftest part of the current. Suspended tightly between these boats were heavy wooden water wheels. The natural kinetic force of the Tiber now performed the work the elevated aqueducts had once done, turning the makeshift floating mills relentlessly day and night to process the grain. The Ostrogothic forces, observing this localized recovery from their camps, attempted to sabotage the new lifeline. They began throwing heavy tree trunks and the corpses of the dead into the river upstream, hoping the rushing current would drive the debris directly into the delicate wooden paddles of the floating mills and shatter them. Belisarius swiftly countered this physical sabotage by deploying heavy iron chains across the water, effectively catching the wreckage before it could strike his vital machinery. It was a brutal, mechanical stalemate that proved the imperial army could adapt to the permanent loss of classical Roman infrastructure. The supreme commander had secured the grain, but starving the city was only Vitiges' secondary plan. His primary objective was already rolling toward the gates. The primary objective materialized through the morning haze as towering silhouettes of timber and iron. Vitiges had constructed massive siege towers, each dragged forward by teams of heavily yoked oxen, designed to dominate the parapets and deliver thousands of warriors directly onto the Aurelian walls. Flanking these behemoths were heavy battering rams engineered to shatter the ancient gates through sheer mechanical force. Realizing that allowing these engines to reach the brickwork intact would be an unrecoverable disaster, Supreme Commander Belisarius did not wait passively behind the barricades. He led a detachment of his elite Bucellari out of the Salarian Gate, initiating a desperate close-quarter skirmish to disrupt the Ostrogothic vanguard before it could properly deploy. The engagement instantly devolved into a chaotic blur of choking dust and the brutal kinetic impact of ironclad heavy cavalry colliding at full gallop. In the center of this frantic melee, the imperial command structure nearly collapsed. Belisarius, highly visible in his officer's armor and directing the vanguard, became the immediate focal point for hundreds of Ostrogothic lancers who recognized the strategic value of his death. His warhorse was struck by a spear and went down, throwing the supreme commander violently into the dirt. For a paralyzing moment, the fate of the entire imperial expedition in Italy hung entirely on a few yards of contested ground. Belisarius was forced to fight on foot, locking shields with his immediate bodyguard to fend off the relentless, driving thrusts of Germanic infantry. This was not a calculated display of mythical heroism, but the brutal, pragmatic necessity of a commander who understood that his authority was the only thing holding the defense together. If his heavily outnumbered men saw him retreat in panic or fall to the enemy, the fragile morale of the entire 5,000-man garrison would shatter instantly. Bleeding and exhausted, the imperial cavalry managed to execute a rigid fighting withdrawal, effectively dragging their commander back through the Salarian gate just before the heavy timber doors were barred shut against the encroaching horde. However, the skirmish had only bought a temporary reprieve. The massive siege engines were still grinding methodically forward. As the Ostrogothic archers laid down suppressing fire against the battlements, the defenders braced for the inevitable structural shock of the battering rams. But Belisarius, quickly re-establishing his command from the high ground of the wall, issued a cold, highly calculated directive that bypassed conventional siege defense. He ordered his veteran archers to completely ignore the armored warriors pushing the engines and the men massing at the base of the walls. Instead, they were to concentrate their heavy missile fire exclusively on the teams of oxen. The tactical logic was absolute and devastating. A siege tower is a terrifying weapon of vertical supremacy, but it possesses no independent mobility. Under a highly disciplined, concentrated volley of imperial arrows, the exposed draft animals were systematically cut down in their heavy yokes. The massive multi-ton wooden towers immediately ground to a halt, permanently stranded in the open field, safely out of range of the walls. Without the oxen to haul them, the carefully engineered engines were instantly transformed from existential threats into useless static monuments of dead timber. Vitige's primary highly anticipated assault had been crippled by a basic logistical vulnerability, forcing the frustrated Ostrogoths to abandon their heavy equipment and attempt to scale the defenses, relying solely on sheer unprotected infantry mass. The imperial archers had neutralized the great timber towers, but further down the defensive line, the Ostrogoths had discovered a structure they did not need to build. They only needed to capture it. The structure the Ostrogoths targeted was the Mausoleum of Hadrian. Originally constructed as an imperial tomb, this colossal cylindrical monument sat on the right bank of the Tiber River, commanding the approaches to the Aelian Bridge. Recognizing its strategic value as a bridgehead, the imperial defenders had hastily converted it into a fortress. Frustrated by the failure of their siege engines at the Salarian gate, Vitiges directed a massive concentrated wave of heavy infantry to storm the mausoleum. The Ostrogoths pushed forward under a wall of interlocked shields, absorbing the plunging fire from the battlements as they closed the distance to the base of the towering tomb. The narrow confines of the bridge and the surrounding colonnades funneled the attackers into a dense, surging mass, creating a brutal bottleneck where the sheer kinetic weight of the Germanic levy threatened to overwhelm the vastly outnumbered garrison. As the assault dragged on, the defenders inside the mausoleum faced a critical logistical failure. They exhausted their supply of arrows and heavy javelins. The Ostrogoths, realizing the missile fire had ceased, aggressively planted their scaling ladders against the brick and stone. In ancient siege warfare, when a defending garrison loses its ability to project downward force, the walls inevitably fall. Stripped of their standard weaponry, the imperial troops resorted to a desperate, culturally devastating tactical improvisation. Lining the parapets of the mausoleum were dozens of magnificent, larger-than-life marble statues of ancient gods and emperors, masterpieces of classical antiquity. With no other projectiles available, the soldiers used their heavy weapons to shatter these irreplaceable monuments. The sharp, deafening fracture of classical marble echoed over the river as the defenders broke the statues into massive, jagged fragments. These heavy marble blocks were then hurled over the battlements, plummeting directly into the packed ranks of the Ostrogothic infantry below. The physics of the tactic were terrifyingly effective. A 100-pound chunk of jagged stone, dropped from the height of the mausoleum, possessed enough kinetic energy to shatter a locked shield wall and crush the heavily armored warriors beneath it. This act of tactical desecration successfully broke the momentum of the assault, forcing the surviving Ostrogoths to abandon their ladders and retreat from the bridge. Yet, the cost was profound. The defenders had secured the perimeter, but in doing so, they had physically dismantled the very cultural heritage of the empire they had been sent to restore, prioritizing the brutal pragmatism of survival over the sanctity of the past. Rebuffed at the gates and the mausoleum, the Ostrogothic command sought a less visible avenue into the capital. Rome was built over a vast ancient network of subterranean drainage tunnels, the most famous being the Cloaca Maxima, which emptied directly into the Tiber River. Recognizing that the broken aqueducts had drastically reduced the flow of water flushing through these systems, Vitiges dispatched specialized infiltration units to navigate the damp, echoing darkness of the sewers. Their objective was to bypass the formidable Aurelian walls entirely and emerge deep behind the imperial defensive lines, potentially opening a gate from the inside. However, Belisarius maintained an internal intelligence network that proved as rigid as his wall defense. Imperial sentries detected the subterranean movement before the Ostrogoths could breach the surface. The Supreme Commander responded with absolute, paranoid efficiency. He ordered his engineers to permanently seal the massive sewer outlets with heavy iron grates and solid masonry, while simultaneously blocking the ruined aqueduct channels with dense stonework. This defensive measure effectively neutralized the threat of subterranean infiltration, but it fundamentally altered the psychological environment of the siege. By permanently blocking the city's ancient arteries, Belisarius had turned Rome into a completely sealed, claustrophobic vault. The garrison and the civilian population were now securely locked inside, isolated from external assault, but trapped with their own dwindling supplies. The walls had held against iron and stone, but as the summer heat began to rise over the stagnant Tiber, an entirely different kind of enemy slipped past the barricades. The sealed gates that kept the Ostrogothic army out also locked the Roman population inside with a rapidly dwindling food supply. As the brutal Italian summer intensified, the landscape outside the walls transformed into a lethal environment. The water spilling from the severed aqueducts pooled into massive stagnant marshes, unleashing outbreaks of malaria and dysentery that cared nothing for brick barricades. Inside the capital, the daily reality of the siege shifted entirely from the adrenaline of combat to the slow, grinding mathematics of starvation. The once bustling ancient markets were reduced to an eerie, hollow silence as the civilian grain rations were systematically slashed by the imperial administration. For the citizens of Rome, the expeditionary force that had arrived as liberators was increasingly viewed as a heavily armed occupying garrison consuming the last of their bread, creating a volatile atmosphere of resentment and desperation. This suffocating environment inevitably bred a profound internal threat. Prolonged hunger possesses a reliable mechanism for turning loyal citizens into willing traitors, and rumors soon circulated that aristocratic factions within the city were preparing to open the gates to Vitiges in exchange for relief. Belisarius recognized that his 5,000 regular troops could not effectively fight tens of thousands of Ostrogoths outside while policing a starving metropolis inside. He responded with a ruthless, preemptive display of imperial authority. Suspicion fell upon the highest echelon of the city's leadership, specifically Pope Silverius, the very man who had initially invited the imperial forces into Rome. Acting on allegations of a treasonous plot to surrender the Asinarian Gate, the Supreme Commander summoned the Pope, stripped him of his office, and abruptly exiled him to the east. It was a cold, calculated political decapitation, demonstrating to the Senate and the populace that military survival now superseded all civil and religious tradition. Belisarius institutionalized this absolute paranoia directly into his daily command structure. He understood perfectly that the greatest vulnerability of a fortified perimeter was never the thickness of its stone, but the integrity of the men standing watch in the dark. To completely neutralize the threat of bribery, he implemented an exhaustively complex rotation system for the entire garrison. No detachment of soldiers was permitted to guard the same sector of the 12-mile wall for 2 consecutive nights, deliberately disrupting any ability to coordinate a betrayal with the enemy camps outside. Furthermore, the Supreme Commander ordered the iron locks on every single major gate to be physically removed and replaced daily. The heavy metallic clank of new locking mechanisms being hammered into the ancient timber doors became a constant nightly ritual of imperial suspicion. He was systematically stripping away any opportunity for human frailty or greed to compromise the city. By enforcing this unyielding structural discipline, the imperial command successfully clamped down on the threat of internal collapse. Yet, administrative brilliance could only delay the inevitable exhaustion of resources. Belisarius was holding the city together by sheer force of will, but his garrison was bleeding out, and the promised relief from the emperor seemed to be nothing more than a ghost. That ghost finally materialized as the bitter winter of 537 AD transitioned into the early spring of 538 AD. But the true executioner of the Ostrogothic host was the geography they had weaponized. Vitiges had ordered the aqueducts severed to choke the capital, a calculated logistical strike that ultimately inverted upon his own forces. The millions of gallons of water that once fed the imperial baths now spilled aimlessly into the surrounding Campania. The flat terrain absorbed the deluge, transforming the fields outside the Aurelian walls into a vast, stagnant marshland. As the weather warmed, this artificial swamp became a lethal breeding ground for malaria and dysentery. The disease tore through the dense, unsanitary encampments of the attackers. Furthermore, the staggering numerical advantage of 100,000 men suddenly became a fatal liability. An army of that size required massive daily shipments of grain and forage, and the immediate Italian countryside had long since been stripped bare. The besiegers were soon starving in their own trenches, surrounded by the foul, humid stench of stagnant water and unburied dead. The logistical tables turned definitively with the arrival of the long-delayed imperial reinforcements. An expeditionary force of approximately 5,000 fresh cavalrymen, commanded by John the nephew of Vitalian, broke through the Ostrogothic screen to the south of Rome. John did not immediately throw his men into a pitched battle against the fortified enemy camps. Instead, adhering to strict imperial doctrine, he executed a campaign of rapid logistical harassment. Operating from secured strongholds along the supply routes, the fresh cavalry systematically intercepted and destroyed the Ostrogothic convoys attempting to reach Vitiges from the north. The strategic geometry of the conflict completely inverted. The Ostrogoths were no longer effectively besieging Rome. They were trapped outside its walls, pinned between an impenetrable defensive circuit and an aggressive mobile force, severing their own lifelines. By mid-March 538 AD, the military math was undeniable. With his army severely degraded by fever, starvation, and constant tactical friction, Vitiges accepted the grim reality of his failure. After a year and 9 days of unbroken, grueling warfare, the Ostrogothic king ordered a full withdrawal. Unwilling to leave perfectly constructed fortifications for the imperial army to occupy, the Germanic warriors set fire to their 7 massive siege camps. Thick, towering columns of black smoke rose from the burning timber palisades into the spring sky, a visual admission of defeat marking the end of the blockade. The fragmented, exhausted host turned their backs on the Eternal City and began the long march northward, funneling their remaining thousands toward the critical crossing of the Milvian Bridge. Supreme Commander Belisarius watched the retreat from the parapets, but he did not allow the enemy to simply walk away. Recognizing that a retreating, demoralized army is at its most vulnerable, He waited until the precise moment when the Ostrogothic vanguard had crossed the Milvian bridge, effectively splitting their forces across the Tiber River. He then ordered the gates thrown open. The surviving imperial heavy cavalry surged forward in a highly coordinated sally, slamming directly into the isolated Ostrogothic rearguard. This was not a reckless pursuit for glory, but a cold, calculated operations designed to maximize casualties and permanently cripple the enemy's ability to reform. Caught off guard and violently compressed against the riverbank, the Germanic heavy infantry lost their unit cohesion. Hundreds of warriors, pushed backward by the kinetic shock of the imperial charge, plunged into the fast-moving currents, their heavy iron mail dragging them straight to the bottom of the river. The siege was officially broken, and Belisarius had achieved the impossible. But as the smoke cleared over the Tiber, it became undeniably clear what exactly had been saved. The Rome that emerged from the smoke of 538 AD was no longer the capital of classical antiquity. It was a hollowed, fractured shell of its former glory. The imperial army had held the 12-mile perimeter and broken the Ostrogothic war machine. But the physical infrastructure that had sustained the metropolis for centuries was permanently destroyed. The severed aqueducts were never fully repaired, forcing the surviving population to abandon the elevated aristocratic hills and crowd tightly along the muddy flood-prone banks of the Tiber River simply to maintain access to drinking water. This desperate localized reality would dictate Roman urban life for the next 1,000 years. Before Vitiges arrived at the gates, the city still supported a population of well over 100,000 citizens. But the brutal combination of famine, dysentery, and mass civilian exodus reduced that number to a mere fraction. Vast, silent stretches of the once glorious urban center were left entirely abandoned, slowly being reclaimed by creeping marshland and wild vegetation. This staggering demographic and structural collapse marked the definitive end of the ancient world in Italy. The grand marble baths, the sprawling public forums, and the complex intercontinental logistical networks that had defined the Roman Empire were irrevocably replaced by a localized agrarian struggle for survival amidst monumental ruins. The tactical genius of Supreme Commander Belisarius had achieved exactly what Emperor Justinian demanded, securing a spectacular, almost impossible military triumph against overwhelming numerical odds. Yet, the brutal paradox of the imperial reconquest was that the very act of reclaiming Italy systematically dismantled the classical civilization it was intended to restore. Belisarius had successfully protected the geographical coordinates of Rome, but the civic soul of the city he fought to preserve had been permanently shattered alongside the ancient marble statues hurled from the mausoleum of Hadrian. He would go down in military history as one of the most brilliant defensive commanders of late antiquity, a master of interior lines, logistical improvisation, and unyielding psychological endurance. But his defining victory at the Aurelian Walls stands as a highly solemn testament to the devastating, irreversible cost of imperial ambition. The 14-month campaign proved definitively that while a highly disciplined regular garrison of 5,000 men can outlast and break an encroaching army of 100,000, absolutely no amount of military brilliance can reverse the turning of a historical era. The Eternal City survived its greatest siege, but it crossed that threshold directly into the long defining shadow of the Middle Ages. Subscribe to our channel to relive the great chapters of history together.